This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussions become a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, those of you that have listened to multiple episodes of the podcast know that one of my biggest concerns, perhaps the biggest concern, is the suppression of speech which is occurring and has been occurring for a number of years in the U.S., some of it in such a way that we don't really even think of it as suppression of speech. But it is happening. Well, something related to that, actually part of suppression of speech, has been happening and has come to a head recently. The two things that have brought that matter to a head are the treatment of the Covington Catholic kids and the Jussie Smollett hate crime hoax. What is the issue? The issue is the bigotry inherent in the way people who wear Make America Great Again hats or otherwise outwardly show support for President Trump are being treated. As I noted back in episode 20, MAGA is the New Black, there's an effort underway to treat the act of supporting Donald Trump publicly by wearing a Make America Great Again hat as an act so worthy of derision that the effect is to prevent persons wearing the hat from being treated fairly and equally by those who oppose Donald Trump, whether those persons be members of the media reporting on events involving those individuals, celebrities commenting on those events or those individuals, or potentially government bureaucrats administering government services to those individuals. That is absolutely wrong. It is immoral, and it must be called out as such. It is a form of bigotry. Bigotry is defined as intolerance toward those who hold different opinions from oneself. That is a precise description of the attitudes of those who attack and abuse and deride those who wear MAGA hats or otherwise outwardly show support for President Trump. The fact that those who abuse those who wear MAGA hats are doing so in a republic, a country where the people are supposed to choose their leaders through elections, makes the bigoted conduct of those abusing persons wearing MAGA hats that much worse. The point of a republic is that the people get to choose their representatives. When the representative you want to win doesn't win the election, you prepare for the next election. You don't physically attack and verbally abuse and view as liars or criminals or the dregs of society those who voted for someone other than the person you wanted to win. If you want to engage in such obnoxious conduct, then you don't in fact want to live in a republic or any other form of democratic society. You want to live in a dictatorship in which you hope the person in charge has the same views as you. That attitude, by the way, is completely contrary to the oath of office in this country. Therefore, no one elected to office in America should hold that attitude. Unfortunately, it is becoming widespread on the left, including among its elected officials. The most recent instance of it being exhibited had been the treatment of the Covington Catholic kids by the media and Hollywood, as I discussed in episode 20, MAGA is the New Black. But now there's a more recent example. Last week on the UC Berkeley campus, Turning Point USA, a conservative student organization, was recruiting at a table on the campus. Their table included a poster which said, quote, "Hate crime hoaxes hurt real victims," and another which said, quote, "This is MAGA country," close quote. Apparently the table or the posters or the fact that the persons at the table were promoting Turning Point USA was enough to anger an apparent student in a gray hoodie who approached one of the persons at the table and cursed at him and told him he was, quote, "encouraging violence," to which he responded, "No, I'm not." The interesting part of that exchange is when the person in the gray hoodie objects to the Turning Point representative recording him with his phone, and the Turning Point rep advises him that he's recording the exchange because he seems, quote, "erratic," close quote. At that moment, you can see a sense of clarity or realization on the guy's face when he actually seems to realize, maybe I am erratic and it's no wonder the guy's recording me. He walks away, continuing to complain about the guy recording him, But that's when another guy in a black t-shirt steps in and hits the Turning Point representative, knocking his phone out of his hand, cursing at him and continuing to attack them. There are two videos, one of which shows the attack from about 20 feet away, and another which shows it from the perspective of the guy being attacked. The second video shows the attacker threatening to shoot him if he hits back. That Turning Point representative never hits the attacker in the black shirt. The final blow is best seen on the video from about 20 feet away, and it is a serious punch audibly landed. The Turning Point rep ends up with a black eye and a bloody nose. It appears that the sole provocation for the attack was the act of promoting Turning Point USA on a college campus, noting on a poster that hate crime hoaxes hurt real victims, which incidentally is an undeniable fact and matches precisely the objections raised by multiple African American public figures on the left in response to the arrest of Jussie Smollett for apparently perpetrating a hate crime hoax. As noted, the other poster said, "This is MAGA country," which certainly doesn't seem to be a true statement at Berkeley. But anybody that's provoked to violence by that statement on a poster is a genuine public threat. A police report was filed. The university condemned the attack, and the Berkeley Police Department later advised that they had a potential ID on the attacker and that he's not a Berkeley student. To date, the attacker's name has not been released and he has not been arrested. I expect, however, that he will be located and arrested soon. One of the more disturbing aspects of the video is that people can be heard laughing and giggling in the background during the attack. On Twitter, someone that appears to be a Berkeley employee posted comments indicating positive feelings about the attack. Multiple other persons on Twitter who indicated they were students, but for whom it's unclear whether they are Berkeley students, also indicated support for the attack. These violent attacks on people doing nothing more than exercising their right to free speech, in the vast majority of instances expressing support for President Trump or his policies, with the vast majority of attackers being left-wing activists or college students, must stop. Frankly, I'm fearful that in Berkeley, once they catch the attacker, they'll give him a slap on the wrist because they sympathize with those who hate Trump, because much of the city hates him as well. If that occurs, I think the U.S. Attorney's Office should consider whether there are any federal charges which could be levied in light of the political free speech in which the victim was engaging and for which he was being attacked. Incidentally, in light of my fear about whether the attacker would get a slap on the wrist in Berkeley, I should note that when CNN chose to cover this incident, they referred to it as an, quote, alleged, close quote, attack. It's on video. It isn't just an allegation. It's crystal clear that the Turning Point rep was attacked. Think for a moment about the incredible hypocrisy of CNN for outwardly appearing to accept from the get-go Jussie Smollett's claim that he was the victim of a hate crime, even though the circumstances were so ridiculous that any competent journalist actually acting as a journalist as opposed to a propagandist would have had serious doubts about the veracity of his claims, and then labeling an attack on a conservative in Berkeley actually documented on two different videos as alleged. I recently had a lengthy political conversation with a stranger sitting at a bar. He was a die-hard Trump opponent. He expressed a thought which is so ridiculous from a historical perspective that you would think he must be a very young, uneducated person. Specifically, he said that wearing a MAGA hat is equivalent to wearing a swastika. That's a statement of such jaw-dropping historical ignorance that it's hard to comprehend how anybody could reach that conclusion. It's discouraging that any American would harbor that belief. What makes it even more discouraging is that this individual is more than 30 years old and has a college degree. But if you think about the ridiculous thoughts that you hear and see on CNN and MSNBC and much of the rest of the media which is on the left or leans to the left, you can see how it could happen, especially if the person is not very informed about the history of the Nazis and Hitler and World War II. But this person claims that he's extremely knowledgeable about history. His justification for claiming that wearing a MAGA hat is equivalent to wearing a swastika? Well, he says it's Trump's racism as reflected in the dog whistle terminology that he uses. Now, I reject outright the claim that President Trump is speaking using racism hidden in dog whistle terminology. Most of his policies are straight-line conservative policies, with a blending of progressive measures, especially in the immigration arena, designed to protect the working class. None of it is racist or frankly even racial in nature, and I've talked about the logic of his immigration policies in multiple podcast episodes. But what makes this individual's claims particularly absurd is that he's putting Trump on par with the Nazi regime because Trump is allegedly secretly saying racist things by hiding them in dog whistle terminology. Think about how absurd it is to compare that to the regime of Adolf Hitler. Hitler didn't hide his anti-Semitism. He wrote a book about it and spoke about it publicly and constantly. Brutal dictators don't tend to speak in dog whistles. Now, I expect I'll encounter this individual in the future. And make no mistake about it, I won't hesitate to bring the issue up again. I'm going to keep pushing on it. Perhaps I'm tilting at windmills, but I'm going to continue to try to convince him that wearing a MAGA hat and outwardly supporting Trump is nothing more than supporting a political position with which he disagrees. And his job, if he wants to be a responsible American citizen, is to vote for the candidates that he supports in the next election. And if he wants to debate with Trump supporters while awaiting the next election, he should feel free to do it and be absolutely confident that nobody's going to physically attack him. Supporters of President Trump deserve the same consideration. Next topic. College diversity of thought. Well, we talked all the way back in episode 4, entitled Everybody Knows It, about how we can ensure that colleges actually start presenting a diversity of thought. I threw out there for consideration. It would be overstating it to say I proposed it because I expressed concerns about whether it was going too far from an executive action perspective for the Trump administration to issue an executive order stating that colleges which do not promote a diversity of thought are not actually educational institutions and would therefore not qualify for federal government money. And it would also prevent students attending those institutions from relying on federally guaranteed student loans or federal grants to attend them. I speculated if President Trump were to even talk about such action, it would prompt extreme anxiety among the governing boards of colleges, because a college being designated as not an educational institution and therefore not allowed to receive federal grants or allow their students to receive federally guaranteed student loans would wreak havoc with the bonds issued by the colleges, which could then raise the potential of liability for members of the overseeing body which ignored the warning from the president and allowed the institution to be so designated. Well, it looks like someone has decided to go the legislative route to address the issue, and that certainly eliminates the concern about the executive action I suggested constituting an overreach. Specifically at powerlineblog.com on February 12, an article by Paul Myrongoff appeared entitled Promoting Intellectual Diversity on Campus, a Legislative Proposal. It addresses an effort by conservative commentator Stanley Kurtz, who among other things is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Kurtz is trying to address the disturbing absence of debate on college campuses regarding a wide variety of issues. He advises that George Lanou, a professor of political science and public policy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, is writing a book entitled Silenced Stages: The Loss of Academic Freedom and Campus Policy Debates. Kurtz advises that Lanou researched 24 national policy subject areas, such as the U.S. role in the Middle East, LGBT issues, electoral policies, and gun policies, for example. He found that for most students, there is no opportunity on their campus to hear debates about important public policy matters. He noted that environmental issues and health policy subjects were often discussed, but subjects such as immigration, abortion, government financing, international trade, speech, sexual assault, affirmative action, and even gun policies were almost never debated publicly on campus in 2014 and 15. Kurtz thinks that's a serious problem, and of course, he's right. If students are not offered the opportunity to hear vigorous debate on public policy matters, they really are being shortchanged in the educational experience. Kurtz has come up with a solution. He's pushing a state-level proposal around the country entitled the Campus Intellectual Diversity Act. The legislation attempts to address the lack of debate on college campuses regarding public policy matters by requiring state university systems to fund an Office of Public Policy Events on each campus. The office must invite speakers holding a diversity of perspectives and organize the events. Particular attention to speakers from outside the campus and representing views underrepresented on campus would be required. The model legislation also sets required standards for publicizing events and mandates specific periodic disclosures to state government. So why the detailed requirements? Kurtz's explanation is that university administrations take state reporting requirements very seriously. The fact that the reporting requirements are expressly set out in the legislation must therefore be an attempt to make sure that universities take the requirements seriously if and when their state actually adopts the legislation. Do I like the proposal? Well, actually, I do. It addresses a desperate need at our colleges. One of the key reasons we send our kids there, perhaps the key reason, is for them to learn to think. If they're not exposed to different ideas, they aren't thinking. They're just being indoctrinated. Perhaps the most often repeated criticism of the proposal is that it amounts to a jobs bill for conservative speakers. In that respect, the critics have a point. But in that respect, I also think that's not a problem. Were it not for the typical resistance or outright refusal of colleges to pursue or even accept conservative speakers debating or presenting public policy subjects on their campuses, the need for the bill would almost disappear. If adopted, the bill should correct partially or completely the paucity of conservative speakers on campus. Whether that would extend also to spurring a dramatic increase of the number of debates on campus regarding multiple important public policy matters is unclear, but I suspect it will do so in some locations, and it would lower the resistance to conservative speakers in most or all locations that are public university campuses. That alone would be a tremendous positive development for college students, colleges, and the country as a whole. Next topic. Tony got a fly past. As we find ourselves buried in the latest crazy political or social news of the day, every now and then we stumble upon a piece of news or a development which reminds us how lucky we are and how much those who came before us have done to place us in our fortuitous position. That's what happened yesterday when I stumbled on a story which received minimal coverage in America, but it should have received much more. On February 22, a retiree in Britain cried as thousands joined him at Endcliffe Park in Sheffield, England, to watch a flyover of American and British planes in honor of 10 Americans, the captain and crew of a B-17, nicknamed Mi Amigo, which crashed in the park 75 years earlier. The B-17 was returning from a bombing mission, having attacked the Aalborg airfield in occupied Denmark, a base from which Nazi Germany was launching fighters to attack incoming Allied bombers. The B-17, which was heavily damaged and flying on only one of its 4 engines, crashed in Endcliffe Park. All 10 of the crew members perished. The retiree I mentioned was Tony Foles. He was instrumental in making sure the memorial flyover occurred. But he was not a relative of the crew. He had never actually met any of them. But his part of the story goes back all 75 years. The Mi Amigo was trying to reach a base in Chelveston, Northamptonshire, but in bad weather it ended up 80 miles northwest of the base. The plane circled the park 3 times, presumably trying to land on some part of the open area within the park, but on its 3rd go-around it crashed in the woods, killing all on board. There's a memorial in the park commemorating the lives of the 10 crewmen, which states simply, quote, erected by Sheffield RAF Association in memory of the 10 crew of USAAF bomber, which crashed in this park, 22/2/1944, close quote. The plaque then displays the RAF motto, Per Ardua ad Astra, the Latin phrase which translates to "through adversity to the stars," and then lists the 10 members of the aircrew. Tony Folds was not involved in setting up the memorial on the site. He was just 8 years old when the plane went down in the park. The flyover that occurred on February 22 this year is the only one that has ever occurred at the site to commemorate the crew members. It involved multiple aircraft, both British and American. It started with a Dakota, a twin-engine cargo plane that in America was referred to as a C-47 Skytrain, one of the most iconic of all military cargo aircraft. It was decorated in the colors of 233 Squadron, which was involved in D-Day operations. And after numerous other planes, the memorial flyover ended with a flight of American F-15E Strike Eagles flying the missing man formation to commemorate the fallen crew. The push for the flyover began 6 weeks earlier, when a BBC television presenter, Dan Walker, was walking his dog in Endcliffe Park and happened to encounter the retiree, or pensioner as they say in Britain, Tony Folds. Mr. Folds, who suffers from severe tremors in his hands, was tending to the memorial commemorating the lives of the Mi Amigo crew members who died in that crash in 1944. Walker talked to Folds and learned that the 82-year-old had a dream that he wanted to see fulfilled. That dream was to have a military flypast, what in America we call a flyover, over the park on the 75th anniversary of the crash to pay tribute to the men who gave their lives there. It turns out that Tony Folds had been caring for the memorial and placing flowers there, sometimes up to 6 days per week, for 7 decades. Walker was moved by Folds' story and started a Twitter campaign to try to get the flyover approved, and almost immediately was in touch with high-ranking members of the U.S. Air Force and the RAF. The Twitter campaign was hashtag #GetTonyAFlyPast and then changed to hashtag #TonyGotHisFlyPass when it was approved. So who is Tony Folds? The 82-year-old retiree with trembling hands, who devoted 7 decades of his life to tending to a memorial to 10 American World War II bomber crew members who tragically lost their lives on a cloudy day in the woods of Sheffield 75 years ago. Well, on that cloudy day in 1944, when a heavily damaged B-17, running on one engine with oil spurting from it, flew low over Endcliffe Park, there were eyes looking up from the greens of the park. They belonged to Tony Folds, an 8-year-old boy hanging out with other kids. As Tony looked up, the pilot waved to the children and circled. As any kid would, Tony waved back. On his third go-round, the plane couldn't make it over the trees and crashed in the woods nearby. Tony Folds says that years later he realized why the pilot was waving. He was trying to get Tony and the other kids to get out of the way so that he could land on the green, open area of the park. Tony's been racked with guilt ever since. He believes that the pilot crashed in the woods because he was trying to avoid hitting him and the other children on the green. As Tony Folds put it, quoted in dailymail.co.uk, in an article by Mark Dwell dated February 22, he's devoted his life to the memory of those crew members, quote, because they saved my life. I wouldn't have been here if it hadn't been for them. They're my family. Close quote. Tony did go on to have children and grandchildren, and they must no doubt be as moved by his dedication as the BBC's Dan Walker and I and thousands of others have been. One additional positive of this emotional flyover is that Tony was able to meet Megan Leo, the cousin of Airman George Williams, one of the crew members on the Mi Amigo. She expressed love and admiration for Tony and made very clear that he should not feel guilty and that what happened was not the fault of the kids in the park. After you're done listening to the podcast, if you're interested in additional details regarding the event and Tony Folds, the Daily Mail article I mentioned is a good place to go. Whenever you feel that you're facing just too many challenges, think about the grace, honor, and dedication with which one 82-year-old British pensioner, Tony Folds, has lived his life, and the bravery displayed by the crew of the Mi Amigo. We owe a debt of gratitude to them and to the millions of other Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen who made our lives in this great country possible. Thank you, Pilot Lieutenant John Krieghaus, Co-Pilot Second Lieutenant Lyle Curtis, Navigator Second Lieutenant John Humphrey, Bombardier Second Lieutenant Melchor Hernandez, Radio Operator Staff Sergeant Robert Mayfield, Waist Gunner Sergeant Vito Ambrosio, Flight Engineer and Top Turret Gunner Staff Sergeant Harry Estabrooks, Waist Gunner Sergeant George Williams, Ball Turret Gunner Sergeant Charles Tuttle, and Rear Gunner Maurice Robbins. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. I thank all of you listening out there for giving me the opportunity to speak with you each week. I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.